So my topic is reinventing design, and I wanted to think about what I would do if I had a time machine. Has anybody ever wanted a time machine? As a designer, if I had one, I'd probably go back and see all the people I worship and that have inspired me as a designer. And these are just some of who these folks might be. We might notice there's a slight lack of diversity back then in design. And I kind of wonder, what would I tell these folks? Would I say things have gotten better? Have they gotten worse? And I may even look at some of my contemporaries. And I have some great contemporaries, and we've made a lot of leaps and bounds in design in terms of diversity, in terms of where we apply design. But I'd also have to be honest in that a lot of what design is about, visual design, and all aspects of design right now, a lot of the ways that we treat it is lipstick on a pig or candy, right? We don't look at the full power of design and what it can do. And we'd probably have to be pretty honest and say design is used for a lot of really trendy, superficial things today versus what it was used a long time ago when the people that I idolize as a designer used to practice design. Paul Rand was a very famous designer, designed many of the logos that you've probably seen in America if you've ever looked at the IBM logo or the UPS logo. He did not work with a procurement officer when he was a designer. He worked with the chairman of IBM. A lot of us that are designers right now don't have that level of respect for our practice and the relationships that we have. We're vendors, we're not partners, right? We're not advisors anymore. And I probably have to be pretty honest and say that that's something that's pretty challenging to design, and it's something that we need to improve and we need to fix. So when I think about reinventing design, one of the practices I like to do is think adjacently or use lateral thinking and see if there's other people or disciplines or professions that we can think about and see if there's some core attributes that we can take away and make design more fundamental and relevant to people. And I think you're going to find that even if you're not a designer, that some of the things that I'm going to talk about are going to be personally relevant to you. And I'm going to promise right now that some of these things, when you do all of them, will look like magic. And you will be considered a magician if you can apply them in your own life. This is my source of inspiration for this. This is John Hughes. Many of you might know John Hughes. He was a famous film director. He was also a father and a grandparent. He was a writer. He worked in advertising. And he died very young last year, taking a walk in New York. He was 59 and he had a heart attack. And while his premature death was a tragedy, I think some of the things that he did in his life, and not just as a director, but as an individual, as a man and a husband, are things that we can learn from. And when I think about John Hughes, I'm from Chicago, I think about Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And there was this wonderful adventure in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where Ferris woke up one morning, and what did he say? He said, "How can I go to school on a day like this?" And he also offered some advice to all of us, which if you just had a one-sentence mission statement for your life, life moves pretty fast. Stop and you may miss something, right? We can learn that from him. And we can learn that Ferris Bueller's Day Off was almost a movie about John Hughes and some of the principles in his life. It wasn't just about going to a ball game. It was about some things that were more fundamental. And I want to use his life to talk about these 7 things and what I think they are and how they apply to design. So the first concept that I really want to talk about is what directors do, right? Anybody that's a student of cinema may have heard of the auteur theory, which is the director is in charge of the whole vision for a movie and accountable for everything. That's kind of bullshit. But there's some really important things that we can learn about directors, and that's having a sense of vision, right? And what that sense of vision actually means. And we know vision when we see it. It's not about necessarily getting things right the first time, but it's about having those sets of core principles that can actually guide the decisions we make into things that we do. And that means even if we don't do things perfectly, when we want to reinvent things and think of different experiences, it gives us ways to do that. In this example, we're looking at a new interface paradigm that might be in mobile phones soon. Other folks that really think about this, when you think about design and you think about any organization that we're in, is a gentleman named Stone Yamashita from Northern California who helps companies reinvent themselves. And one of the things he talks about when we talk about a design vision is being in balance. And there's certain core attributes that we have when we're in balance. And this chart is kind of indicative of that. But the sad reality is that most of us have a discombobulated design vision, right? And we're out of alignment and we're out of phase. And this is a really nice, polite way of saying this is when we create beautiful crap, right? Or we expertly solve the wrong problem. And as designers, we do this all the time because we've let some of our core principles lapse. We've let ourselves become vendors, and we've let others dictate the value that we can bring to the table. And I think having a vision is a pretty important aspect of being a designer. When you look at Paul Rand, when you look at Walter Gropius, when you look at some of these titans in our history of design, they are people that had a vision. I'm not sure that we all have a vision still today. Another concept that I want to talk about is the idea of stopping, listening, and looking. We live in a life right now where we're so excited to tell everybody what we're doing that sometimes we don't actually pay attention to the experience that we're having, right? We're Twittering, we're blogging, we're having a conversation with a friend, we're talking on the phone and texting at the same time, and we miss things. Reflection is a core component of being personally effective as a designer. And when I talk about reflection specifically related to John Hughes, he did something very important. He journaled. He wrote about things, right? He wrote about the writing that he did. He would talk about 16 Candles, a script that he actually wrote in 2 days. Or he'd talk about Ferris Bueller's Day Off, a script he wrote in 5 days, and how many pages he would write every day. He filled notebooks. How many people have a notebook in the room? How many people journal or capture their thoughts? I would suggest one of the single most important things you can do is keep a journal and write and collect things. Benjamin Franklin did it. John Hughes did it. I'm suspecting they were onto something, right? And John Hughes had dozens of journals in his home. He had boxes of artifacts that he collected over his years. He even had letters that he wrote to his grandchildren that were only 1 year old when he passed that they could open during different birthdays. He thought very carefully about his life. And he thought very carefully about how he would collect all these assets and what they meant to him. And it actually influenced his life, a big part of his life that we as people that aren't personal friends with him didn't really realize, which is that reflection allowed him to choose what he wanted to do to be happy. And that was to stop making movies. Now, we can extend the whole concept of reflection into another idea, which is drawing. How many people draw or sketch? Drawing can be scary, right? Has anybody ever been in a room when you don't know how to draw and they ask you, draw me a picture or something? It gets really scary, right? Even designers get scared. I get scared when people ask me to do that in public. But sketching is a core concept of effective communication. And it's a core thing that designers can use and that everybody can use to be effective. And when I think about sketching, one of the most important things to understand is genetically, we're wired to understand sketching. It's how our brains are designed. So it's a much more effective way for us to communicate concepts and ideas than just about anything else. That's why we scratch paintings on the walls in caves thousands of years ago. And just to prove it, we're going to do a test. I'm going to show you a sketch really quickly. It's going to be really hard, but I want you to guess who it is. Are you ready? Everyone can identify this picture. But if we had a detailed photograph of him, somebody might say, oh, you know, Santa, that's black Santa Claus. I'm not sure Santa Claus is black. Or I'm positive Santa Claus is black, right? Or Santa doesn't look right. He has got too thick of a beard, right? There's all these concepts that can confuse us when we simplify things with a sketch that can actually help and enhance our understanding and our ability. And as designers, this is a core concept about where we can bring value to the table. But when we think about design, one of the challenges we have right now, especially folks like me, is that increasingly we're talking about a digital realm that we have to design for. It's how a photograph works, right? It's how a device or an iPhone or something may work and how we work. And sketching alone can't convey everything that we need to do. Imagine if you had to draw a picture to say, this is how I turn off my phone and what happens to the icons, right? It's kind of hard to do. So one of the things we can do as designers is look at new tools and technology that can help us take the power of sketching to build interfaces. And this is actually an example from an application that lets us animate sketches to show interactions and interactivity. And this is a very powerful way to do things because right now sometimes we have to actually build things and invest enormous amounts of time in doing things that we should probably throw away, right? Because it's not the right way to solve something, but once you've built it, it gets pretty hard to throw things away. So this helps us come up with better ideas. Does anybody know what the best way is to have a great idea? It's to have 100 of them, to have 1,000 of them, right? And then be able to distill which ones are the best ideas. And when we think about that with sketching, and we compound that with reflection, we get a powerful set of skills that starts bringing us back to the table and establish our vision that I think design lost a long time ago. Now, John Hughes, I said he worked in advertising, and he did. He eventually got a job at Leo Burnett, which is a very distinguished agency in Chicago. But his real passion was humor. And he used to write for National Lampoon. And what he would often do is he had an agreement with his management that, you know, look, I'm going to go do some writing for National Lampoon, but I'll also do my job. But he would actually go out there and plan his day very carefully. And some days he would admit that he'd actually sneak to New York, and he'd just set a cup of coffee on his desk at work in Chicago in the morning. And this was, you know, back a long time ago, you could actually fly to New York and fly back. And everybody just thought, oh, John just stepped away for a bit, and he'll be right back. And this kind of brings up the concept of planning and how important planning can be. And when I say planning, I don't mean you have to know everything perfectly and you need to be rigid and inflexible. I mean you have to have a guiding set of principles that's going to inform what you're doing and why you're doing it, and having that feedback mechanism so you can make the right choices. And when we think of planning, there's a large history of people planning pretty carefully. This little chart here is one that Charles and Ray Eames actually drew for IBM for their design process for how they would do things for IBM. If we look today, we see effective processes are really built around the idea of iteration and moving quickly. And what is the best way to iterate? Well, the best way to iterate things is to start simply. And one of the simplest ways you can start doing anything is with sketching. Don't build it for real. Draw a picture of it. Draw 1,000 pictures, and then pick the 10 that matter most. And then pick the one thing that you think is best that you have to actually build. And this chart is actually one that I adapted from a Microsoft researcher named Bill Buxton, where he talks about the value of prototyping, right? You know, where you build something that kind of says this is what it's going to look like. We see this all the time in real life. We may not realize it, but if you've ever seen a Pixar movie, you're seeing the second version they made, right? Because they always make a version first that's a lower fidelity version of the movie to work out everything that's going to actually happen in the movie. And sketching is a great, important process, but at some point we need to go beyond it and we need to prototype. And if anyone's ever heard a designer pitch where you've had to work with the designer, we'll always come in and have a process that we go through, different steps that we go through. And folks will always ask you, well, when will my design be done? You know, when will we know it's right? And we always jokingly say, well, that's where the miracle occurs, right? And I'm here to tell you the miracle actually does happen, and where it happens is at that intersection between sketching and prototyping. It's where we can actually validate our ideas and make that breakthrough next step to solving the right problems. The challenge right now, though, is we live in a world of such high fidelity that we try to build things before we know they're the right things to build. We try to solve problems before we know they're the right problems to solve. And some of these principles about having a vision and reflection and sketching can help us be more effective with those things. So the next concept I want to talk about is one that we've touched on a little bit today, but it's probably one of the most important ones at all. And that's really focusing on authenticity. And when we think about John Hughes, what was really important about him is he fundamentally understood his audience. John Hughes was very young when he got married, and he moved and settled into a comfortable suburban life for him at a very young age. And in fact, he had a lot more in common with the teenage children of some of his neighbors than he did with his neighbors themselves. And for those of us that grew up in the 80s, I suppose if you were white and middle class to a degree, he seemed to really understand what we felt and what we suffered with, right? And he really captured this ethos in a pretty important way in terms of, you know, we could have the best day in the world or the worst day of the world. And when we think about authenticity as designers, this is something pretty important too. If we think about sustainability and we think about the environment, we could offer that designers are great champions of being effective in that space, but we could also offer that designers are incredibly guilty of doing horrible environmental things, right? We design the things that nobody needs, right? We help people sell those things that nobody needs. We use all the paper and the marketing and everything else to help people be effective and use all that stuff when maybe it's not the right thing to do. And that was a pretty important principle, which leads us to our next point, which is around curiosity. And John Hughes was known as making mixtapes and iPods of music that he curated over time. And this curiosity led to fascinating options for everybody that worked with him and interacted with him. And this concept of curiosity reflected to the things that he wrote, right? And the things that he kept for his children and his grandchildren. And when he had that curiosity, it made him more effective and impactful in the movies that he made. And he singularly really understood what teen angst was about, right? Where, you know, the worst day and the best day of your life could all happen in the same day. So the last concept that I want to talk about is probably the most important one at all. And it's one that all of us that have a passion for a reinvention probably have to take away from today. And that's really focused around mentoring. And mentoring right now is probably one of the single most valuable and important things you can do. You don't need to be an expert to do it, but you have skills and knowledge today that are important to somebody else. There's someone that you can help and that you have skills to help. And John Hughes mentored a lot of the people that he worked with over the years, including some of the actors that he worked with for a long time. And these are principles that we don't do enough of anymore. There's a culture of self versus a culture of community and helping and empowering people. And I would submit that those of you that want to be personally effective in reinvention have an obligation and a burden to actually find somebody and mentor them. And we see mentoring in design right now. We see individual designers that do this. We see this with Jason Santamaria. We see this with Verley's blog. We see this with design education. But I'd like to submit that after today, when you're sitting at your desk tomorrow or your hotel and you have that cup of coffee on your desk, that you stop and think about what you're doing and understand that things do move fast and that sometimes stopping and paying attention to them and employing some of these practices that can make us more effective in design can make you more personally effective as well. And they may look like magic. Thank you.